All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring how Rome didn't just conquer the misty island of Britain with swords. I mean, they did do that, but they actually held it for 4 centuries using an absolute masterclass in cultural assimilation. We're going to see exactly how architecture, the economy, and even education became weapons that were honestly just as potent as a legionary spear.
So, think about this for a second. Look at the vast, incredible scale of the Roman Empire. Why would an empire spanning the entire Mediterranean, totally rich in resources and bathed in sunshine, risk sending tens of thousands of its absolute best troops beyond what they literally considered the known habitable world? They were sailing across these treacherous, unknown waters to an island famously populated by fierce Celtic tribes who fought in chariots. What was the massive prize that actually justified all of this risk?
Well, there is a stark contrast between the political spin and the reality. On paper, Rome claimed this was just a rescue mission, right? They were simply intervening to restore an exiled pro-Roman British ally, King Boudica of the Atrebates, who'd been pushed out by a rival tribe. But let's be real here. The actual reason? You had a newly crowned Emperor Claudius, elevated to power after the assassination of Caligula, who desperately needed a glorious military victory just to secure his shaky throne. Plus, Rome was extremely hungry for Britain's legendary mineral wealth. We're talking gold, silver, and tin.
Now, the psychological hurdle of this invasion was absolutely immense. The ancient historian Cassius Dio perfectly captures this. These are battle-hardened veterans, and they actually mutinied in Gaul. They flat out refused to board the ships, completely terrified of crossing the channel into the great unknown. It got so bad that Claudius had to send his freedman, Narcissus, to address the troops. The soldiers ended up mocking Narcissus, shouting these festival slogans at him. But you know what? That bizarre distraction ultimately broke the tension and finally got them onto the boats.
Once they did cross the channel, likely landing at Richborough, the campaign moved ruthlessly fast. The defining moment was this massive 2-day battle on the River Medway against the British leaders Caradocus and Togodumnus. General Aulus Plautius deployed a special unit of Gauls who were actually trained to swim across rapid rivers in full armor. They completely surprised the British chariots by specifically targeting and wounding their horses. This just plunged the native forces into total chaos, totally paving the way for the emperor's grand arrival.
And Claudius's arrival in the Cativalonian capital of Colchester, it wasn't just a military maneuver. It was pure, unadulterated psychological warfare. He didn't just bring the elite Praetorian Guard and heavy armor. He brought war elephants to Britain. Just imagine the absolute terror of British warriors who had literally never seen anything like these towering beasts. This theatrical display of overwhelming alien power was entirely designed to awe the natives, and it worked flawlessly. It secured the immediate surrender of 11 local kings. Claudius stayed in Britain for a mere 16 days before heading right back to Rome for his triumph.
Engineering a new economy, the resource rush.
Okay, so with the initial military conquest achieved and the propaganda victory totally secured for Claudius, the empire pivoted to aggressive exploitation. To feed the hungry Roman machine, they brought in this highly advanced hydraulic mining process to tap into the island's natural wealth. The Romans built these massive aqueducts to channel huge volumes of water. They'd light huge fires against the bedrock, then suddenly quench that hot stone with the water, causing it to just shatter. The rushing water then washed away the debris to expose incredibly rich veins of lead, silver, and gold. This method was so devastatingly efficient that Britain actually surpassed Hispania in lead and gold production. It was so successful, in fact, that the Spanish actually filed an official complaint with the emperor to limit British output.
But beyond just extracting metals from the earth, the Romans totally restructured the landscape itself. They established villas, which, we often think of as luxury country homes, but they were actually large-scale, highly organized agricultural centers. These villas mass-produced and exported cattle, massive amounts of grain to feed the legions, and famously, highly prized British hunting dogs. They were basically funneling all of this immense wealth back to the continent, integrating Britain incredibly deeply into the wider imperial economy.
The Romanization playbook: force versus consent.
Now, economic extraction on this immense scale requires long-term stability, right? You obviously can't mine gold and farm grain if you're constantly putting out rebellions. And this brings us to a really deep scholarly debate, highlighted by Karl Mazurek's analysis. The Roman writer Aulus Aristides actually once boasted that the Roman Empire was the first to rest on consent rather than force. So scholars debate this constantly. Was the Britain's adoption of Roman culture just a spontaneous local survival tactic, like a way to get ahead in a brand new world, or was it a highly deliberate state-sponsored program of pacification designed by Rome?
Well, looking at the evidence, the state-sponsored program relied on very specific tools. The Roman state actively introduced urban grid layouts to replace what they saw as chaotic tribal settlements. They established Latin as the mandatory language for law and high-level trade. They introduced the toga as the ultimate status symbol, built these magnificent public bathhouses, and instituted the imperial cult. They were actively, deliberately transforming fiercely independent local chieftains into pacified, Romanized aristocrats.
The ancient Roman historian Tacitus, whose father-in-law Agricola was actually a governor of Britain, by the way, offers a highly cynical yet incredibly perceptive view of this whole process. He objectively reported that the Britons eagerly adopted what he called these alluring vices, the baths, the banquets, the togas. But Tacitus drops a really heavy judgment here. He states that the Britons mistook this cultural assimilation for civilization, when in reality it was just a misidentification of their own slavery. They were essentially being conquered by comfort.
And the physical evidence actually firmly backs up Tacitus's theory of intentional Romanization. During the Flavian period, we see this massive, concerted building boom all across Britain. Grand civic structures like the forums at Verulamium and Cirencester didn't just pop up accidentally, right? They acted as very real physical instruments of a deliberate policy to show the Britons the superiority and permanence of the Roman way of life.
But this went far beyond just laying bricks and pouring concrete. It was really about shaping minds. There is strong evidence that Flavian policy actively subsidized schools in Britain. We even have records of a Greek schoolmaster, Demetrius of Tarsus, working way up in York. The Romans were intentionally educating the sons of native British leaders in Latin and Roman rhetoric, because if you capture the minds of the next generation of leadership, you ensure the long-term loyalty of the province, for sure.
However, it is incredibly important to note that this wasn't just a total, violent erasure of native culture. The Romans were honestly far too pragmatic for that. They absolutely required worship of the emperor to prove political loyalty. That was non-negotiable. But they allowed local Celtic deities, like the water nymph Coventina or the river god Verbies, to exist right alongside the Roman pantheon. This created a highly effective, blended, hybrid culture. You could basically remain British in your local heart, as long as you were Roman in your civic duties.
So I will leave you with this final, provocative question to ponder. Knowing everything we've covered in this explainer, what is the true nature of imperialism? When those British chieftains put on the toga and walked into the Roman baths, were they doing it out of a desperate need to survive, a greedy ambition for power within a new system, or were they victims of a beautifully orchestrated illusion of consent? It perfectly demonstrates how the Roman Empire managed to hold the misty island of Britain by the toga just as much as by the sword. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the Roman playbook.